Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Listen, you may not know this about me, but I am a pretty picky person. Some of this comes from my military background. After spending, almost 23 years in a certain service where they idealize things like efficiency and optimization, it just kind of rubs off on you. But also, I've just kind of been hardwired this way as well. I've always been like this, even before I joined the Navy. And this pickiness will bleed over into all aspects of my life. For example, if I'm going to watch a movie, then I will usually wait until the sun goes down because I don't want to sit in my living room and have the sun getting in my eyes while trying to watch a movie. And so I like my conditions to be at least a little bit better than normal. But I'm also not at the point where I'm buying a super nice TV or surround sound or anything else like that. I just kind of want things to be good. If I'm going to listen to one of my favorite albums, then I often will try to get like the remixed or remastered version of it, unless I don't really like the sound of that one and I like the original one better. But either way, I like to be at least discerning about what I prefer. I've mentioned it before, but I used to be a cookbook author, and one of the successes in that world as well was being just a little bit more particular when it came to my own tastes. So it wasn't enough to make a pretty good pot of jambalaya. I wanted to make the best one possible with the ingredients and time that I had. So long story short, yes, I am someone who is driven by ideals. I want something to be as good as possible within reason, not to the point where, trying to make it perfect takes away from the overall experience, but you should always be mindful of how good of an experience you can get. And I'm the exact same way when it comes to gaming. I want to be able to have the best experience possible as efficiently as possible as well. And when I think of gaming today, I think of three different categories. We have handheld gaming, and then also console gaming, your PS5 and stuff like that, and then also, of course, PC gaming. And obviously some of these will bleed into the other. But when it comes to handheld gaming, I think we are pretty much in a nirvana state right now. We've got a ton of different options from, very cheap handhelds that can emulate things all the way up to PC handhelds like the Steam Deck or ROG Ally, and I think that everything between there is pretty awesome. The pace that handheld gaming is moving in right now makes me very happy. There's always going to be new handhelds coming out and better ways to enjoy them, but as it stands right now, I am just a happy camper. And I think that console gaming is in a good spot as well. Basically ever since the Xbox 360 era, we have been eating good. There's no shortage of awesome games that you can play on your TV sitting at your couch, and I think that's great. I also think that over the past 10 years or so, PC gaming has kind of reached its own renaissance period as well. When it comes down to it, each of these have their own little nitpicks, but as it stands, I think there is no better time to play video games than right now. And so you're probably wondering, what is my point about this? I'm talking about being picky, I'm talking about the ways that you can play video games. The thing is that me being this person who wants to have everything really optimized, I don't think that we're in a perfect spot when it comes to just gaming in general. And it doesn't have to do with the individual components of handheld and PC and console gaming. Like I said, I think that all of these are in pretty good spots. It really has to do with the sum of all three, because I think that they are all kind of firing on all cylinders in their own way, but as a collective, I think there is more improvement that can be made. And so when we talk about things like the optimal way to watch a movie or listen to an album, let's talk about my optimal way when it comes to playing video games. And really, it's no surprise if you watch this channel at all, but I really just want a Super Nintendo Switch experience. I want to be able to play my favorite modern games on something like the Steam Deck or the ROG Ally, and then plug them into some contraption that's hooked up to my TV or my PC monitor, and then I can play those same games, but in a better resolution and better frame rates. And this gives me the best of both worlds, the ability to have a really good handheld gaming experience, but then also a really good console-like or PC gaming experience as well. And the trick here is that I do not want two separate devices to do the same thing. I hate the idea of buying a desktop PC and buying a handheld PC and then having to maintain these two different operating systems and drivers updates and everything else just so I can play the same games on these two different platforms. But unfortunately, that's kind of the way it goes right now. If you want to have a good desktop gaming experience, then you should get yourself a desktop. If you want a good handheld experience, you should get yourself a good handheld. And there are workarounds for it. You could take that handheld PC and plug it into a monitor and you'll get some pretty good frame rates, but it's going to look pretty bad on a bigger screen compared to a smaller handheld screen. You could also take a beefy desktop and then stream it to a cheaper handheld. That way you're not duplicating any sort of work, but that also relies on a bunch of other factors. And so ideally, we would have a Nintendo Switch experience where we would take our handheld PC, play it as it is, and then when we're ready, we can plug it into a dock and then play that on a TV or monitor, but at a higher resolution. And when we have that handheld PC docked into a computer monitor, it can just be a computer, so we can use it for work-related tasks and things like that as well. And ideally, this will be a one computer solution, the handheld PC plus some sort of external dock, which kind of brings us to what started me thinking about this video in the first place. About a month ago, I got a new external GPU in the mail. It's the OneXGPU 2. And I've reviewed half a dozen of these at this point. In fact, the previous ONEXGPU I reviewed earlier this year. And the one recurring theme with all these eGPUs is that they are a royal pain in the neck to test and review. I spend more time troubleshooting and running into problems than I actually do finding moments where I'm playing a game and thinking, oh yeah, this is totally worth it. And the ONEXGPU 2 is no different. I ran into problem after problem the entire time that I was testing it. We'll talk about that a lot in this video. And honestly, I don't think it's the fault of the company. It's rather just the environment that it's trying to launch a product in. The problem is that there are a bunch of people trying to cobble together solutions in a PC space that hasn't really articulated what the actual problem is. And so that's what I want to discuss in this video, is where I see all of the problems when it comes to external GPUs and using them with handhelds, and then where we could maybe go from here. And yeah, we'll talk about the ONEXGPU 2 for a little bit as well. Okay, let's start by talking about just using eGPUs compared to something like streaming from a desktop PC. And the idea with streaming is that it is desktop first. So the idea here is that you will just build whatever desktop you want, get a mini PC or a full tower that will meet your needs when it comes to both gaming, productivity, work, all that kind of stuff. From there, you want to make sure you've got good Wi-Fi at your house so that you can stream things back and forth with minimal latency. And then of course, you'll need some sort of platform to be able to stream to. That could be a tablet or a handheld gaming PC. And there is just a wide variety that you can use. You can even use your phone. And there are a lot of solutions out there that are pretty good. You could take the GameSir G8 Plus. This is like an $80 handheld, right? Put your phone inside of this, stream from your desktop PC, and you've got a pretty nice console-like handheld experience. And the nice thing about this is it's only an $80 barrier to entry. And so you can invest all your money in the PC as opposed to having two different things. Now, there are some drawbacks to this type of setup, and number one would be offline gaming. For example, in about 4 days, I'm going on a flight to California. That's like a 6.5, 7-hour flight here from Hawaii. And I'm not going to be able to use a controller like this hooked up to my phone to be able to play like games from my PC. And I just started playing Ghost of Tsushima on PC, and I picked it up on the latest Steam sale for, I don't know, like $30-something. And I am sucked in. Like, I've only played it a few hours, but I can already feel the draw of wanting to play that game every day. So I want to play that on that flight. I want to spend like 6.5 hours straight playing this game. And that sounds super awesome, but I would not be able to do that on my phone like this. Another thing is your home Wi-Fi connection. For example, there are often times when I want to stream at my house in the evening time, and I just can't get it because of the bandwidth in my house. My son also likes to play games at night. He plays Minecraft with his friends, and so often when he's playing, I can't play at the same time, just even locally streaming from my PC. And so those little things do prevent me from saying that streaming would be an ideal setup. It'll definitely work in a pinch, and I think when it does work, it's great. But those moments when maybe you feel a little bit lag when you're playing, or when you just can't get it to work because you're in an offline environment or you have bad bandwidth at your house, those really just start to drag it down. So when it comes down to it, a desktop first experience where you make the desktop PC and then you try to funnel that over into a handheld sometimes just doesn't work out. And this is the opposite approach to like the Nintendo Switch. That is what I would consider to be a handheld that is consoleable, as in the handheld is the primary mechanism, but it can also be used on a TV. And so now let's talk about Nintendo Switch-like experiences where you take something like a beefy handheld that can play its games on its own, but something you can plug into something else to be able to play on a TV or a monitor. And it really comes down to external graphics cards at this point, and you've got two different categories for that. The first is what I'm calling BYOGPU. And the setup for this is going to be very similar to this thing right here. So this is basically a dock that you put a power supply into, and then you bring your own GPU here, you plug this in, and then you plug this into your handheld. And the nice thing about a setup like this is that it can be relatively cheap, but then also upgradable. So this dock is like $100, $110, and then you have to get a power supply. I think this one was like $50 or something. So really you're looking at, $150 to $200 for the setup, and then you can get your graphics card, whatever you want. So this is like an RTX 3060 Ti. It's like a $300 graphics card, but you could put a $200 one in here. You could put an $800 one in here. Basically whatever you would like in terms of the setup. But the problem with these kind of setups is that they're pretty few and far between. This one from Minis Forum is great. I did a whole video about it, but it does have one drawback, and that it is only Oculink capable in terms of connection. And Oculink is a standard that's still relatively unpopular. You can find it on a few handhelds, but not many. And so you wouldn't be able to use this on an ROG Ally X, for example, which uses USB 4 as its external GPU connection. Another popular option is the Razer Chroma X. Now this thing is old, like they don't even sell it on Amazon anymore, but I did pick it up about a year or two ago for like $500. It did come with a power supply, but still, that was quite expensive. But the nice thing about this one is that it works with full-size desktop graphics cards, so you can just bring whatever GPU you want. The big limitation of this one is that it's only Thunderbolt 3, which caps out at 40 gigabits per second, which means that the bandwidth that you're getting from your GPU, even if you have a really beefy GPU, may not be enough to sustain really good graphics on whatever platform you're using. And so the limitation here has to do with the cable that's connected from your PC over to that GPU. Now the Oculink port that's available in this Minis Forum one, for example, it still has those same limitations, but it is at a higher standard. So this can give you 4 full PCIe lanes, which is going to be like 64 gigabit per second. So using the same GPU with this one compared to the Razer Chroma X will give you better graphics. There are other docks out there, but they're pretty few and far between, but these are the two that I've tested, and that gives you an idea of at least what that kind of setup will be like. My main takeaway when it comes to these is that they are large, not very travel friendly, but they're upgradable, and that's a big thing for me. Now the other category of external GPUs are going to be those like this, which is basically just a laptop GPU within its own enclosure with its own cooling. And this one here is the OneXGPU 2, which kickstarted this whole video in the first place. And the main difference between these ones and the BYO GPU ones we were talking about earlier is that these are going to be more travel friendly. They are smaller, but they're not upgradable. This one has the laptop GPU soldered inside of it, so this is not meant to be replaced. So let's run through the OneXGPU 2 here really quickly, just to get an idea of what this whole experience is going to be like. And let's start with the price, which is quite expensive. They're asking $1,000 for this thing. And it's really hard to tell whether or not this is a good value because this graphics card that's within the OneXGPU 2 is not used in anything else. This one uses the AMD Radeon RX 7800M, which is a brand new GPU. But the thing is, it hasn't been released in any other product as of today, so no other laptops or eGPUs exist. And so it's hard to say that from these specs alone that it's going to be worth it because I don't really know what to compare it against. According to the tests from OneXPlayer, which should be taken with a grain of salt since they're the ones selling this thing, they say that the performance here is actually better than an RTX 4070 laptop GPU. And generally the going price for a laptop with a 4070 inside of it is like $1,100. And so the price here is somewhat comparable other than the fact that, a laptop has a lot more components in it than just an external GPU. So really when it comes down to other products on the market, it's really hard to compare with the OneXGPU 2 just because there isn't anything else out there. So instead, I think we should probably just look at what you will get for this price point and then measure whether or not that's going to be worth it for you. Now on the front, we've got our power button, and below that, we've got a lightning bolt button. This is the turbo button. And this will be on by default, and it'll actually go up to 180 watts, which is pretty unprecedented when it comes to a laptop GPU. This might be one of the reasons why they haven't used this GPU in any other laptops, because that's a huge amount of power draw, which is going to just suck the battery life out of a laptop. And then finally below that, we've got an RGB toggle button and then also an LED indicator to let you know whether you're in or not in turbo mode. Now for all my testing, I did keep it in turbo mode, and I figured, if you are going to get an eGPU like this, you probably want to get the max performance possible. And one thing of note, that RGB toggle will toggle through, I think, like 8 different presets, but there's no off button. And so no matter what, you're going to get some RGB lighting. It's just a matter of which RGB lighting you want. This is probably my first big nitpick about this eGPU, is they should have the ability to turn off the RGB if you don't want it. Now looking on the back, we've got an Ethernet port as well as 2 USB ports. I wish there were more USB ports on this, at least 4. After that, we've got 2 DisplayPort 2.0 ports and then an SD card slot above that. After that, we've got HDMI 2.1 and 2 different ways we can plug this into our computer, both Oculink and USB 4. And on the far right, we've got our barrel power plug. Now one thing worth noting, this eGPU is only meant to be stood up vertically. And it's pretty easy to tell which way goes up because the top part will have a fan exhaust vent, but the bottom will not. But the thing that concerns me about this is that the power plug is at the very top of the eGPU when you set it up vertically. And it always bothers me when I see something like this because the most important plug I think should be closer to gravity, like down on the bottom. When you put a power plug up atop like this, it almost feels like a trip hazard and that something bad is going to happen. And so just overall in terms of design, I wish this was a little bit more fleshed out. Now thankfully an eGPU like like this is going to remain relatively stationary, and so it's probably not that big of a deal when all things are considered. And so even though this is a nitpick of mine, I don't consider it to be a deal breaker. Now, one nice thing about the ONEXGPU 2 is that it has an M.2 slot. This just has a magnetic cover. You can pop this off and then put a 2280 drive inside. And this will work out well if, for example, you've got certain games you only want to play while docked. Like you're going to have a handheld, you're going to walk around with it, play some lightweight games, and then when you plug it in, you're ready to play a AAA game instead. And that means you won't have to store that AAA game on the handheld and take up a bunch of storage. Instead, it'll be on the M.2 drive. Now, the power brick on this thing is massive. It was like this with the previous ONEXGPU. This thing is 330 watts and is pretty darn big. And this whole thing is pretty darn heavy. The GPU alone is like 1,600 grams, and then you add the power brick as well as the cables, we're looking at 2,370 grams. And 2.3 kilos is about 5.25 pounds, so this thing is over 5 pounds. It's pretty heavy. And it is quite massive if you compare it against the previous ONEXGPU. This one has the Radeon 7600M XT inside of it, so a slower GPU, but it is quite a bit smaller. And this one had a very similar setup to the other one, although it was horizontally based. But it also had that M.2 slot, which I think is a really neat feature on these two GPUs. And honestly, this one is still pretty big and heavy compared to other eGPUs, but it is a lot smaller than the one we're reviewing today. In fact, it's only 1.6 kilos, which is like 3.5 pounds. And so from a hardware perspective, the ONEXGPU 2 is pretty big and heavy. It's not something I would consider to be travel friendly given the fact that it is over 5 pounds. So let's talk about what kind of performance we can get from this thing. Let's start with a best case scenario. We're going to use a mini PC because it's not going to be constrained by overall wattage. So for this example, let's use the Minis Forum UM7080 XTX. Now this is actually an Oculink mini PC, but I don't want to use the Oculink connection because I think that USB 4 is just more universal. And so to get a good comparison here, we're going to stick with USB 4 across both mini PCs like this one, as well as handhelds. And this mini PC is using a Ryzen 7 7840HS. This has the AMD Radeon 780M integrated graphics inside. And this is the same kind of integrated graphics that you will find in the ROG Ally as well as the Lenovo Legion Go, so I think it's a good comparison. The big comparison here is that this computer can go up to a higher wattage of TDP, so this one can max out at 45 by default. And that will give us some pretty great performance. If we look at playing this game in 4K in original settings, then I can get an average frames per second of about 55, and I think that's pretty good with something like Horizon Zero Dawn. Of course, this is just a benchmark, and I always like to test things with actual games, so let's actually jump into the game itself and see how it performs. And yeah, sure enough, 4K original settings with this game gives me about 55 frames per second on average. And so this is a big jump. I would expect to only get about 45 frames per second when playing at 1080p without the eGPU with this mini PC. So we're able to jump it to basically 4 times the resolution at 4K and still get very similar performance. Here we are with Marvel Spider-Man. This one's running at 4K and with FSR quality enabled, so this is going to drop it down to like a 1440p, but with that resolution upscaling. And here you can see that with these settings, I'm getting an average about 45-50 frames per second while playing in a pretty heavy-duty scene. So this to me is a pretty great gaming experience at a much higher resolution than what you can get just on the mini PC alone. One more test here, so this is 4K low settings with Elden Ring. I would get a couple dips when it came to actual combat, but honestly, when I'm playing this game, I just get so freaked out by the difficulty of it that I'm never looking at the frames per second, I'm just trying to survive. But long story short, if you were to use a mini PC like this, hooked up to this external GPU, yes, you're going to get a big boost in overall performance. But let's be honest here, this is far from optimal when we're discussing what we talked about in the beginning of this video, where I want something that's kind of compatible between both handheld as well as a desktop setup. And taking a mini PC and hooking it up to an eGPU is not an ideal situation for me. That's basically just making a better mini PC, but it doesn't help anything when it comes to portability. At this point, we're just making a cobbled together desktop that might be a little bit smaller, but is quite a bit uglier than a nice desktop tower and isn't as upgradable. So this kind of setup with a mini PC and eGPU is really hard for me to recommend just because, yes, it improves your overall mini PC performance, but it's kind of a stopgap compared to what we're actually talking about, which is a handheld and then a desktop hybrid. So let's get to the heart of the matter, which is a good handheld PC hooked up to an eGPU to kind of give us the best of both worlds. And a setup like this is handheld first, which means that you should pick the best handheld first, right? And so for me, that would be something like the Steam Deck, but that one's out because it doesn't have eGPU capability. Then you're looking at something like the ROG Ally X or the Lenovo Legion Go. I would consider these to be the best two handheld PCs out there outside of the Steam Deck, which obviously we can't factor in just because it doesn't have eGPU support. And so ideally, I'd be able to play on my ROG Ally X in handheld mode, and then plug it into this eGPU, and then be able to have those upgraded graphics on my TV or monitor. And one of the best upgrades of the ROG Ally X from the previous ROG Ally is they've added a USB 4 port, which makes it compatible with this eGPU. But unfortunately, from a software perspective, it actually is not compatible. And that's because the ROG Allies use custom drivers from AMD that are built specifically for this chipset and for this device. And those AMD drivers have not been updated to support AMD eGPUs like the one we're reviewing today. And so plugging in my ROG Ally X into the OneXGPU 2 does nothing. It doesn't connect or anything. It's just basically a glorified USB-C dock at that point. And I'm crazy. I have multiple ROG Ally X's, and they have two different BIOSes running on them, the newest BIOS as well as the previous version, and neither of these will work within Windows. Now, thankfully, you can dual boot the ROG Ally X into a Linux-based operating system called Bazzite. I made a whole video about that as well. But unfortunately, Bazzite doesn't work really well with external GPUs either. When you use it in the regular SteamOS interface, nothing happens. But if you boot it into the Linux desktop environment, then yes, you will at least be able to get it to work on an external display. And theoretically, from there, you could launch Steam, then go into big picture mode, and then launch your games from here. But unfortunately, this interface just gets completely bogged down when you try to do it this way. And I'm not sure what's really going on here, but essentially the interface itself will only run at about 8 to 10 frames per second. It is super sluggish. And so just launching a game will take upwards of 5 minutes to navigate through the menus, and it's really frustrating. And if you're lucky enough to get a game to boot, it's going to be all over the place. For example, you can't bring up any of these SteamOS interface menus, and so you're not able to bring up, for example, like your stats monitor to be able to see how many frames per second are actually running. In fact, even going into these menus will often make the game crash or just unresponsive. And so more often than not, when I tried to go into any of these menus, I had to hard reset the device. And strangely, every time I hard reset it and went back to the desktop environment, it made me sign into Steam all over again, like I hadn't done anything before. And so this was a really frustrating experience just to get a single game running. It took me almost a half hour. So I just kind of had to feel my way through in the actual in-game menus to actually start booting up the game, but even then it was a terrible experience. I tried to play Baldur's Gate 3 at 1440p medium settings, which would be just fine for this eGPU, but it was completely bogged down. I was running at about 20 frames per second and all sorts of graphical pop-ins. It was just an unplayable experience. Now in the Baldur's Gate in-game menu, there's the ability to change what they call graphic adapter, which is basically between like the internal integrated graphics as well as the external GPU. Unfortunately, the menu is truncated so much that I can't actually see what I'm selecting. Either way, I tried both of the two options, which should theoretically be the integrated graphics and the eGPU. And unfortunately, with both of these settings, I got the exact same result, about 20 frames per second, completely sluggish, and all sorts of pop-in. And bear in mind, this is one of the few games that I got to actually boot while in that desktop environment. Most of the other games would just completely crash when I started to boot them up. And so long story short, when it comes to the ideal handheld setup, which would be to take my favorite Windows-based handheld, the ROG Ally X, plug that into an external dock like this one, which is ostensibly the most powerful eGPU dock that you can find right now, it just doesn't work, and it's all AMD's fault. They made the chip that's in the ROG Ally X and all the drivers that run it, and they also made that GPU that's in the OneXGPU and all the drivers that run that as well. And so it's super frustrating to me that the AMD graphics card will not work on an AMD machine, and it all has to do with the drivers. Now there are ways to get this to work. I could nuke the drivers that are on this and then install just generic AMD drivers on it, and then it would actually work. But the thing is that some of the features within the ROG Ally X would no longer work as a result. And honestly, I don't want to do AMD's job for them. They are the ones that should be making this update, and so that's a bridge I'm just not willing to cross. I think that this should all just work, especially within an AMD environment. So again, I'm the kind of guy who wants an optimal experience, but I'm not going to go down like super long rabbit holes to get there. I like to hear music that sounds good, but I wouldn't consider myself to be an audiophile. I'm not going to research $10,000 headphones. Instead, I just want something that works and is good. And unfortunately, an ROG Ally X setup, which I think would be ideal and should work, does not. And unfortunately, it's the exact same experience with the Lenovo Legion Go. This one also has specialized drivers that do not work with AMD-based eGPUs. And again, you could nuke these drivers and install your own, but unfortunately you will lose out on some other aspects, for example, integer scaling with this beautiful screen. And so again, it's just a major hassle to be able to use some of the best handheld PCs that are out there right now with an AMD-based eGPU. And at this point, with over a year since the Legion Go has first released, it almost feels like false advertising at this point. You know, they've been talking about having a USB 4 port available on this with 40 gig per second connection, but what are you going to use that connection for if not an eGPU? And given all of the options that we have available, they should probably work with AMD-based GPUs as well, and they just do not. And so I find this whole setup pretty frustrating, and that the handhelds that I want to use with an eGPU solution like this just simply don't work, and it's a software issue. Now, the ironic thing is that the smaller handheld PC manufacturers, those who just rely on the generic chips and drivers from AMD, these ones actually work out just fine with either GPUs from AMD or NVIDIA. So a good example here would be the OneXFly. This is a handheld PC made from the same people who make the GPU we're looking at today. Now, I'm using an older model, but the most recent model has the Ryzen 7 8840U in it. The one that I have is a 7840U, so it's a year older, and I did a review about this as well. The thing is, these all use the same integrated graphics, the Radeon 780M, same as the ROG Ally and the Lenovo Legion Go. But because this just uses the same generic drivers that you can find directly on the AMD website, it will work with these eGPUs. So getting the OneXFly to work with the ONEXGPU 2 was just a matter of updating my AMD drivers. Now, the thing about these smaller handheld manufacturers is that they don't have a large quantity of scale, which means that the prices for these handhelds, by comparison to the larger companies like Asus and Lenovo, they're more expensive. So the current version of the OneXFly, which is the 8840U version, is about $900 compared to, $700 or $800 for the Legion Go or the ROG Ally X. But one thing of note, they're about to release the new OneXFly. This one is going to have the new AMD AI chip inside of it, which should be a pretty healthy performance boost from the previous one. This one's also going to have an OLED display that goes up to 144 Hz, so I think this might actually be a pretty good handheld. I've always found the OneXFly to be very comfortable. But also bear in mind the pricing on this is significantly higher, so about $1,000 for the Ryzen AI 9 365, and if you want the HX 370, which I think is the better between the two, this is like nearly $1,400 for the lowest spec model. Either way, the setup we've been talking about throughout this video, taking a handheld PC and plugging it into the OneXGPU 2, it actually works with the OneXFly. And so now that we finally do have a handheld that's actually working with this eGPU, let's talk about what kind of performance gains we can expect. We'll start by doing some time spice scores here, both between, just the handheld and handheld mode, but then also the older OneXGPU and then the newer one as well. Now, the handheld itself maxes out at a 30-watt TDP, which is going to give us just shy of 3,000 points with the 3D Mark time spice score. And this is about what I expect with the Radeon 780M iGPU, so no surprises here. Now, if we plug in the older model, OneXGPU, this is going to give us around 9,000, just shy of that. And again, this is about what I expect from the Radeon 7600M XT. Like I mentioned, I've tested quite a few external GPUs with this exact setup, and usually about 9,000 is what I can expect. So again, no surprises here. It's a little bit on the low side, 8793, but again, we are working with a 30-watt TDP with this handheld. And if we switch over to today's eGPU, the ONEXGPU 2, we do get a pretty healthy bump, up to 12,807. The CPU score is going to be about the same, about 7,000, but that is a healthy jump in the graphics score. In fact, that's about a 50% increase over the previous eGPU model. Let's do one more benchmarking test. This time we'll use Horizon Zero Dawn like we used earlier. We'll start with the handheld itself, so this is running at 1080p in medium or original settings, and the average frames per second here was 45. Now, switching over to the first eGPU, I'm going to bump up the resolution just a little bit, so this is going to be at 1440p original settings instead of 1080p. And even after bumping up the resolution like this, we still get a healthy increase in FPS. Now we're looking at an average of 66. And if we move over to today's GPU, that's the ONEXGPU 2, we're getting an average frame rate of 90 frames per second with 1440p original settings. So again, we're looking at nearly a 50% increase in performance between the older eGPU model and this one here. And again, this is all over USB 4, not even Oculink. Now that we do have a healthy setup, let's talk a little bit about some of the quality of life features. First is going to be fan noise. And I will say that it gets relatively loud. I would say not quite like a jet engine sound of some gaming laptops, but pretty loud. Let me give you a listen. Overall, it's going to be louder than a nice desktop that has like a bunch of room for the air to circulate, but again, I don't think it's overwhelmingly loud. Another thing to consider is going to be ambient heat of the eGPU itself, since it is a pretty compact enclosure. And here I found that the outside temperature when running pretty hot is going to be about 50 degrees Celsius. That's like 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So it is definitely toasty to the touch. And when looking at the exhaust part of the GPU, it gets even hotter, about 69 degrees Celsius. Nice. And so it does definitely get toasty on the outside of it, but I never found the GPU itself, in terms of internal temperature, to get super hot either. And so I think this is still relatively fine. So now that we've talked about benchmarking and some of the quality of life experiences, now let's actually talk about gaming on this thing and what you can expect. We'll start with Final Fantasy XVI, another game that I picked up during the current Steam sale, and I've been playing, just through the prologue right now. And I found that this works out pretty well when it comes to handheld settings. On the OneXFly, I've set it to 900p resolution with low settings and a 30 frames per second cap. It's still going to dip down below 30 frames per second. I think a lot of this just has to do with optimization of this game engine, and so it is a little bit stuttery. But overall, I would say this is perfectly playable, and I think it looks really good at 900p. Now, when we swap over to the eGPU, I was able to boost up the resolution quite a bit to 1440p and medium settings. And in this kind of setup, I got an average between 45 and 50 frames per second, so a lot smoother of a gameplay experience. And so this is what I'm talking about, the ability to have a nice handheld experience that is perfectly acceptable, but then also plug it into a monitor or a TV and have a nice console-like experience as well. Let's use one more game as our example. Let's do Ghost of Tsushima. And like I mentioned, I have fallen hard for this game. I think it's great. And it's also really well optimized for handheld. So here playing at 1080p low settings is actually a really smooth experience. Now plugging it into an eGPU, we get even better performance. I can play this at 4K in medium settings, and I can usually get about 55 or 60 frames per second. And so again, this is the ideal situation that I've been looking for, to be able to play it really nicely on a handheld, but then also plug it into an external GPU and have an even better and elevated experience. So here's the ironic thing, is that for the most part, I would consider a lot of these smaller handheld manufacturer PCs to be not as good as something like the ROG Ally X or the Legion Go. In general, I just think that some of these bigger companies have more capital to be able to make these better handhelds and to be able to offer them at more competitive prices. In addition, something like the Ally X and the Legion Go, you can find those at Best Buy, which means that if something goes wrong with it, you can just return it, which is not something you can really do with these smaller Chinese manufacturers. And so ideally, the setup that I just found with the OneXFly is exactly what I would want with the ROG Ally X and the Lenovo Legion Go, but it's not possible without jumping through a bunch of OEM hoops. And to go further down this path, one of the other ironic parts is that one of my least favorite handhelds, the MSI Claw, actually works great with this eGPU because it uses an Intel-based chipset. So this one doesn't have any of those conflicts that we were having previously with the AMD versus AMD. This one just allows you to install the AMD drivers, and from there it's going to detect the eGPU, and you can just go and start playing your games. And so by far the most seamless setup for all these handhelds happens to be the one that I kind of like the least, and that's the MSI Claw. And admittedly, even though I don't really enjoy using the MSI Claw for various reasons, which I talked about in my review, I'll leave it linked down below if you haven't seen it yet, it really comes down to the fact that it's actually really good when docked. And plugging into this eGPU does give me some pretty great performance. For example, with Marvel Spider-Man, I can play this at 4K and low settings, and then turning on FSR quality, which is going to give me about a 1440p upscale. And it's not going to give me a full 60 frames per second, but the gameplay is smooth enough for me to consider it to be a console-like experience, and this is exactly what I'm looking for. Other games that are quite demanding, like Control, I can play at 4K low settings and mostly get 60 frames per second the whole time. It'll dip down here and there, especially when lots of things are happening on the screen, but this is one of those games where I would just turn off the FPS counter and just enjoy it as it is, because you can't really notice when it does dip down. And so long story short, among all the handhelds, when it came to a docked experience, ironically, it was the MSI Claw which gave me the best experience. This Intel chip is super power hungry and not really well suited to be used in a handheld, but in a docked mode like this, it's actually really performant. So in wrapping up this section, talking about, the eGPU and the handhelds and how that all works together, it is a little bit funny that, the handhelds I actually want to use a setup like this with just don't work at all. And then also, the smaller handhelds that cost a lot more, like the OneXFly, those ones work fine because they have generic drivers. And then the handheld that I like the least that's come out over the past year or so, which is the MSI Claw, this one is way expensive and doesn't perform well on the handheld side, but works great as a docked solution. So it's also a little bit of a mismatch there as well. And so among all the solutions that we have here with the ONEXGPU 2, I'm not really happy with any of them because I don't find any of them to be optimal. Now this next part is probably going to ruffle some feathers, but I've been testing these things for almost 2 years at this point, all sorts of different configurations, and there's only been one that actually worked for me, where I thought to myself, okay, this is the future. This is actually enjoyable to the point where I find it to be plug and play, and I can also just use this as an everyday driver, and that has been the original ROG Ally and then the XG Mobile component. Now there are many reasons why this setup is not ideal for many people. In fact, Asus is kind of pivoting away from this in the first place. But hear me out, because I do think that among all of these situations that we have, including the one we're reviewing today, I still think that this one is the best setup. In fact, I used this setup for about a year as my main Windows PC at my house, and it was a great experience. Now to start, we need the original ROG Ally. This is a great handheld that is hampered by a smaller battery, but honestly, everything else is pretty great. And over this last Black Friday/Cyber Monday deal, it was actually down to $500 for the Z1 Extreme model. And I think that's a really competitive price point for this handheld alone. For $500 to be able to get this much handheld is pretty great. Now, unfortunately, the XG Mobile suite, which started in 2021 and started getting phased out in 2023, just really isn't for sale anymore. The only place you can find an XG Mobile for sale is going to be on Asus's website. They don't carry it on Amazon or Best Buy or Newegg anymore. And the model that they carry is unfortunately the 2023 model, which they still sell for $2,000. Now, this has a mobile 4090 inside of it, which is a really powerful GPU, and it's honestly not the one that I own. This one is way too powerful and way too expensive. And so I don't recommend this one because I don't think that any eGPU solution should be $2,000 no matter what. At that point, you can just buy a desktop PC. Now, the one that I own is the 2021 version. It's the Mobile 3080 one, so it's not the newest one. It is not the most powerful one, but I do find it to be super convenient. Unfortunately, they don't sell this one new anymore. You just can't find it, but you can often find it on eBay for around $900 to $1,000. Now, there are all sorts of risks of buying a GPU used, so you really got to know what you're getting into here, but that's at least the price point that you can get for the setup that I have today. And honestly, the setup for this is really simple. So all you have to do is just plug it into the top of the ROG Ally and then flick a little switch on the XG Mobile itself. From there, it's going to ask you to confirm that you want to set up your XG Mobile. Once you tap on the screen, it's going to ask you to kill a couple apps, and then after that, it's actually going to connect. It probably takes about 30 seconds altogether from the moment that you plug it in and flip on the switch to actually getting video out onto your monitor or TV. But after that, you're good to go. I use this dual laptop stand that I got on Amazon for like 20 bucks, so this holds my XG Mobile as well as the ROG Ally in just one neat little package. And the great thing about this is because I'm using that RTX 3080 mobile chip, it's an NVIDIA GPU, which means that I can just install the NVIDIA drivers and then everything will be plug and play. No conflicts with AMD drivers between the GPU and the handheld. So every couple weeks I'll have to update my GPU drivers, but that's really about it. And from there I can use a docked ROG Ally with increased frame rates. And like I mentioned, this was my primary Windows PC at home for about a year. So this is where I played all my PC games. Now the performance on this is not going to be as good as like the ONEXGPU 2 that we were just looking at, but it's still pretty decent. So here I got like 1440p medium settings with Marvel Spider-Man at a very playable frame rate. And so for me, this is a pretty good solution. It's about 45 frames per second, which again is not going to be like ideal, but still it's closer to ideal than just plugging the ROG Ally directly into a monitor. And part of the reason why I like this setup so much is that it was just really convenient. I love the idea of taking my ROG Ally around with me on travel, and then I can plug this into the XG Mobile when I get home and have that full desktop experience. Not a full 4K experience, but definitely a 1440p one. And if we combine those costs together, like a $500 ROG Ally while on sale, and then like say a $900 eGPU solution, we're talking about something that's about $1,400 to be able to get both a handheld and a desktop experience. Now for $1,400, you can get a really nice desktop PC that's going to blow the socks off of this whole setup. And honestly, for $1,400, you could probably get a handheld like the Steam Deck and then also your own desktop PC, and it'd still be pretty good. But again, that's not going towards this optimal, ideal, picky kind of situation that we've been talking about, where I want to have just one computer that I can use in multiple different use cases. And so like it or not, the XG Mobile plus ROG Ally has been the ideal setup when we're talking about this super switch kind of console. Now, sadly, my ROG Ally setup has kind of gotten a little bit worse for the wear over the past year. For example, the rubber casing around my connector cable has started to wear off, and this probably has to do with the fact that it's been, curved around this entire time and also in a humid house, and that really wears down plastics there. And so I do need to repair this by, adding electrical tape or something like that. But the honest truth is that I often just don't use this anymore because I use the ROG Ally X more. And so that's one of the reasons why it's even more frustrating that my primary handheld PC, the ROG Ally X, doesn't work with an AMD eGPU. And so I don't really have a good solution to be able to make this dockable either. Okay, so at this point, I think we've done a lot of testing to show what we can expect from an eGPU solution and all the shortcomings that come with it as well, and why I just don't think this is all ready for prime time just yet. And like it or not, the ROG Ally and the XG Mobile setup has kind of been the ideal for me, even if it is a bit antiquated by today's tech standards. And so for the last part of this TED Talk / video about eGPUs, I want to talk about where we could go from here, and at what point do I think it'll actually get to the consumer level where this might actually become mainstream. So there's a couple low-hanging fruit that I think we need to address immediately, and the first is that AMD needs new OEM drivers. At this point, we should be able to use AMD GPUs with the same default drivers that come with the ROG Ally X and the Lenovo Legion Go. I think that these handhelds are excellent, and they should be dockable with an eGPU from AMD, and the software needs to catch up. It's really frustrating to me that my favorite handhelds, the ones that I want to use the most, are the least versatile among all the others. I also think that we need to see more NVIDIA eGPU solutions. The 3080, like this one, is probably one of the best out there. They have the 4090 XG Mobile, but that thing is $2,000. What about the 4070? I would love to see that laptop GPU in an external GPU solution. I think that would be a great mix. And I think that if we have AMD GPUs and NVIDIA GPUs, they're going to start competing with each other. It's going to bring prices down for everybody. And so I think that's a win-win. Not only that, if AMD never gets off their butt and makes OEM driver updates, we'll at least have NVIDIA GPUs that we can use instead to kind of mitigate the whole problem. And I kind of think it's unfair to rely on smaller companies like OneXFly to come up with eGPU solutions that are supposed to solve everything for everybody. I think the OEMs, these bigger companies that have more capital, should put more skin in the game, because I think this is a viable solution for many people. And I think there's a perfect opportunity coming up, and that is Thunderbolt 5, which is going to look like a USB-C standard, but it's going to have faster connection speeds. And Thunderbolt 5 is going to give us 80 gigabit per second connection, so it's going to be about twice as fast as USB 4, but it is still going to be limited to 4 PCIe lanes, so it's still going to be about Oculink speed, so that's going to be 64 gigabit per second when it comes to an eGPU. But still, that is a lot of data to be able to transfer over USB-C, and it's going to be hot swappable, and so that I think is going to be the solution. If we can get Thunderbolt 5 in a good eGPU docking solution, this will start to be able to get to the point where it can break into mainstream. But along those same lines, I don't think that a laptop GPU like the OneXGPU is really the future. These are kind of stopgaps, but I hate the fact that these are not upgradable. So if you spend $1,000 on this thing right now, it's going to work great. But 3 years from now, it's not going to work as great, and there's no upgrade path. So ideally, I think the future will rely on something like this, where we can get a dock that you can buy with maybe a power supply included, make it $150, $200, and then just bring your own GPU. And you can use a desktop class one here, and this will be upgradable. And then, of course, have it Thunderbolt 5. If we have a solution like this that we can plug into something like the ROG Ally X, the Lenovo Legion Go, all of a sudden we've got that perfect setup. Yeah, it's bigger, it's a little bit more unwieldy, but I wouldn't mind putting this on my desk and then using this as my primary PC and then plugging in my handheld when I actually want to use it for PC stuff. And so that's the way I see it, a Thunderbolt 5 dock that'll allow you to bring your own GPU so that way you can upgrade it as you see fit, and then have that connection to other handheld PCs that have that same connectivity. So this is going to require quite a few steps from various different platforms. We need handheld PCs that have Thunderbolt 5 compatibility, and then we also need a dock with Thunderbolt 5, and then of course all the drivers and everything else to make all that work. As far as the OneXGPU 2, I think it's okay for what it does. It gives you a good performance bump. It's a lot better than the previous model. It is bigger and a little bit less travel friendly. I wish it had a bit more USB ports, and I wish you could turn the RGB lighting off. But in general, I think it is at least a pretty good solution, but I'm not sure if it's worth $1,000. There are a lot of conditions that need to be just right in order to make this work. You need to have a handheld PC or a laptop or a mini PC that's going to be compatible with at least Oculink and as well as USB 4. And then also the OEM drivers have to work with it as well. And so this eGPU, like with all the others that I've tested before, it's pretty neat tech. Like the ability to just plug this into something, and get better graphics, it's always really thrilling. But I think that these launch in a hostile environment. I think that other factors outside of OneXFly's source control are actually what need to develop first before we can actually start talking about eGPUs in a serious way. So the way I see it, for most people, I just don't recommend an eGPU, and I don't think you should buy one until a bunch of things fall into place. We should have Thunderbolt 5 as a standard, we should have handheld PCs that use Thunderbolt 5, we should have a dock that allows us to use any graphics card we want and also uses Thunderbolt 5, and the price also has to be competitive. What I think is we need to get to the point where a handheld PC is good enough to use in just a standard handheld kind of definition, but then also it can be plugged into a dock which is cheaper than its own desktop PC that will also turn this into a desktop PC. So ideally, the combination of a handheld PC plus an eGPU solution will be cheaper than trying to maintain two different computers. And I think the first company that really nails this hybrid solution, much in the way that Nintendo did with the Switch but for PC gaming, they're going to have a huge hit on their hands. I just don't know who's going to do it first. So really, that's about it for this video. I know it was mostly a rant that had a little bit of a review in it, but I just felt like it was time to talk about eGPUs because I find them fascinating and frustrating all at once. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Have you ever considered something like this, or do you like the idea of having a desktop PC and then a different handheld elsewhere, you know, for streaming or for just like a handheld PC and just kind of maintaining the two? I mean, things like cloud saves do make this stuff possible, but I really just want a more streamlined solution, and I think that eGPUs are the way to go. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.